Thank you for joining us for our week of Ask the Experts with AGRA, the Association of Genealogists and Researchers in Archives. I'm delighted to have with me today Antony Marr, who's going to help three family historians who sent us their brick walls. Hello, Antony.
Hello, Sarah.
Thank you for coming. So first up, we have Leanne Walker and Charlie Hayward, who asked, can we get some help about the birth certificate for Rosina Rose Podbury? We believe she was born on the 12th of August 1890 in Deptford, Lewisham, and died 8th of January 1970. We believe she was named Rosina Eliza, but went by the name Rose. We have the date of birth on her death certificate, but have been unable to locate a birth certificate. Help! So, Antony, can you help Leanne and Charlie track down a record for Rosina's birth?
Well, I think I can, Sarah. This is one of those difficult ones where I don't think her birth was registered, as far as I can tell. Now, birth registration was compulsory, and certainly after 1874, when the new Birth and Death Act was in, the rate of non-compliance wasn't that high, but there are still some that don't make the record. So I think that's probably the case here. But I think we can track down Rose. The first thing is that she was on the 1911 census. She's living with Thomas and Sarah Littlefair in Belvedere in Kent. She's 20 years old, which would fit with 1890 birth date, but she's described as a stepdaughter. So that would suggest that Thomas isn't her father, but Sarah's probably her mother. So we know that she's probably got a mother called Sarah. Now, they're not telling the truth about their relationship because they claim to have been married for 9 years. But they actually get married in 1918, 7 years later, as far as I can see. So they're being a bit economical with the truth. And that's probably something that runs in the family, I think we're going to find. So if we go back from there to 1890, there is a baptism record in Deptford for Rosina Eliza Potbury with a T. That's how it's in the baptism index. And that's in 28th of August 1890 in St Mark's Church in Deptford. So that fits really well with the 12th of August 1890 birthday that they've got. So I think this is going to be the right person. The parents are Henry and Sarah, and that's Sarah. That then fits with Sarah being Sarah Littlefair in 1911. So that's good. He's a labourer. Now, in the baptism, again, they appear to be married. It's a baptism that looks like a married couple. It just says Henry and Sarah Potbury. But they actually get married the following year in 1891 at All Saints in Newington in Surrey. So they're not being altogether truthful. It's Henry Podbury and Sarah Bagshaw, or Bradshaw she appears at in the bands, but I think Bagshaw's the name. So there's a lot of illegitimacy stroke, getting married a bit late and changing names going on here, which has caused the problem. I can't find a birth registration in Potbury or Podbury. Because she was born before the parents' marriage, it should really be under Bradshaw, which was her mother's name before she married. Again, I can't find it under that either. Now, poor law records on Ancestry show that, unfortunately, Henry Podbury, her father, seems to have been in the workhouse, I think more than once. And he seems to have died in Greenwich Workhouse in 1899. So then Sarah, if she was with him at that time, would have gone off and be living wherever. Now, I think the next thing for our inquiry to do is to try and find Rose and her mum in the 1901 census. I couldn't find them straight away, but a little bit of searching might find them. I suspect she might be living with somebody else under an assumed surname. Not Mr. Littlefair, I don't think, but perhaps somebody else. But it's one of those cases where I don't think there's a birth registration, but the baptism record should fill in the details that she needs.
Well, I think there's lots of avenues there for research.
Yeah.
It is difficult, isn't it, when and those are the difficult ones, aren't they, when people aren't telling the truth, when there's a bit of confusion over dates and names, especially name changes. They can scupper all of us, can't they? So thank you. I think there's lots to go there.
Okay.
More records. So that's fantastic. Next up, we have a query from a Janet Anderson, a birth record for her grandmother, Elizabeth Alice Godfrey. So we're going back a bit further. She says, the first piece of information that I was able to find was her marriage to Alfred Gardner by Bounds in St Luke's, Middlesex on the 4th of October 1880, aged 20, and listed as a widow in the name of Barnett. On 3 of her children's birth certificates, she gave her maiden name as Barnett, on 1 as Godfrey. So in the censuses, she gives her birthplace as Westminster, and I have found an Alice Elizabeth Godfrey born in Westminster in 1859, but I cannot tell if that is the correct person. Can you help? So have you got any advice for Janet on this earlier birth and whether she has actually found the right person? Always tricky to know, isn't it?
It is. Again, we've got somebody who may or may not always be telling the truth here, I think. Now, the first thing is that when she marries Alfred Gardner in 1880, she says she's a 20-year-old widow. Now, she could well be a 20-year-old widow. That would mean she'd married somebody called Barnett and he's died, and because she marries in the name of Barnett. I can't find a marriage of Elizabeth Godfrey to anybody called Barnett, and we also need to look carefully to see if there's a Mr. Barnett who died in what will be a very short window of 3 or 4 years before that marriage. And I can't immediately see one of those either. So why is she claiming to be a widow? Or maybe she is. Maybe she got married in somewhere else. I can't see one in Ireland or Scotland or anywhere, but maybe. But one thing I've often found is when you get a young widow marrying, it can sometimes be a little bit of a screen to hide why she's got a child. So I would always look for, perhaps she's got a young child and she's presenting herself as a widow to hide the illegitimacy of the child. That's certainly something I've seen. So we could look for that. But as the inquirer does say, she's found a possible birth. Now, on more than one census, this lady gives her place of birth as Westminster. So we need to maybe look there first to see. So that's a sort of common fact, not on everything, but on a couple of them. And as she says, there is a birth. It's actually in 1858, not 59. And she's Alice Elizabeth Godfrey, not Elizabeth Alice, but I wouldn't worry too much about that because names get switched around all the time. She was baptized on the 6th of June 1858 at St Margaret's in Westminster, which is the parish church of Westminster, right next to Westminster Abbey. And her parents are Anne and George. Now, Anne's maiden name, according to the GRO index, was Tucker. And the father is George and a farrier. Now, that isn't good because on her marriage, she says her father was Thomas Henry, an engineer. So we've got that mismatch. Now, this is always a tricky one with fathers on marriage records. People don't always tell the truth. They don't always know the truth. If a child's father died when she was very young and the mother remarried, or she was brought up by a grandfather, sometimes you can get a bit of confusion over the father's name, or maybe she invented one if she wasn't sure. But there is a mismatch there and that needs to be investigated. It shouldn't be dismissed. So what I would recommend is we need to look closely at that family living in Westminster, where that child was born in 1858. There is a birth register entry, so a birth certificate can be obtained. The next step really needs to be to follow that family forward to see if this Alice Elizabeth could be Elizabeth Alice, our inquirer's great-grandmother. There's certainly a good chance, but I'm not sure we've got her. But that's where the inquiries need to go next.
So if she follows that Alice Elizabeth and finds she gets married, dies with someone else, then
we're back.
Disappears, then it's not her.
The next step then, I think, would be to follow the sort of friends, associates, neighbours route, the fan network. Look at all the evidence she's got. Who are they living with? Who are they living close to? Who are those witnesses on the marriage, the marriage record we have got? How are they connected? Are they just friends, or are they related in some way? And that's where we need to work that one out. But I think she's got a good chance that Godfrey lady in Westminster might be the right one, but we need to account for that mismatch in the fathers. But that's a common thing that you find on registers, even today.
So finally, we have a question from Alison Bartholomew, this time looking for a death record. So not a birth this time, but a death record. She writes, my great-grandfather, Benjamin George Foxton, married Ellen Eliza Ryan in 1895, and they had 4 children before, according to family legend, he ran away to Manchester with a redhead. My mother never met her grandfather, and she always regretted not knowing what happened to him. I have traced him to 1904 when he was living at 295 New Kent Road, but after that, no sign of him. So he worked in or owned a coffee shop in the New Kent Road. Any advice for Alison, Anthony? Can we find a death record for her great-grandfather?
The simple answer in that one is no, I can't. In that name.
Right.
But this is a good example of tracing people forward in time, and that's always far more difficult. I do some work on tracing living relatives, and it's always far more difficult than going backwards, because it's quite simple that if you have a marriage of somebody, you know that they must have been born, so you can look for a birth register, and then you can look for the parents. If you're going forward, there's all the unknowns you've got to cope with. This man walked out of the house with his redhead. Maybe he did go to Manchester or wherever, but he could do anything at that point. He could have changed his name, he could have emigrated, he could have joined the army, he could have died a week later. There is all those unknowns, and you have to try and account for them all. Now, I can't find him under that name after the dates we're given. There's a George Foxton in the 1911 census living in London, but is it him? Who knows? So you've got to try and think of what might have happened to him. Now, realistically, if we haven't got any more information about where he actually went, it's going to be very, very difficult. Alison did give us a date of birth of the 31st of December 1871 for him. So I've gone and looked in the 1939 register to see if I could find him there, but there's no Foxton with that date of birth. There are obviously many men with that date of birth. Now, my previous police career tells me that when people change their name or a new identity, they often don't change everything because it gets too complicated to remember. So they might change their surname, but they'll keep the same first name, or they'll keep the same date of birth because it's too difficult to remember a new one. So he may, if he lived till 1939, he may be on that register under that date of birth, but with a different name. But tracking him down is going to be awfully difficult. I think we have to look perhaps at emigration. We need to look at records of emigration, see if we can see him on there. I can't immediately, but we need to do a deep search for that. The other thing I would really go for, though, is DNA. I think this man was in his early 30s when he walked out on his family. It's very likely that he may well have had another family somewhere else, and there are going to be cousins who are unknown, and a DNA test might just pop up some names that don't fit with research that might give us a clue there. But that's really where we're going to go. These are always the most difficult things, that usually the husband who just walks out one day to the corner shop and never comes back. Very difficult, very difficult.
I think DNA is breaking through some of these brick walls that simply couldn't be with illegitimacy, but I hadn't really thought, obviously, also with people just leaving. That's not something I'd thought before, but very much. So that's plenty there for Alison to look at. So that's great. I hope, well, plenty, probably too much for Alison to look through. But yes, it's a good tip to search by birth on the 1939 register. But obviously, you'll get a lot of people who share that birth. But sometimes you can filter some of those out. But as you say, he might have emigrated. So again, lots.
I'd look for a Benjamin. I think I'd look for a Benjamin something with that date of birth. Perhaps start there, or a George. But you're going to get hundreds. It's going to be very difficult. I think the DNA route's probably the way to go, because a man of that age at that time, if he did go off with another lady, there's likely to have been another family, and there often is. Even
if she doesn't get an immediate hit, they can update, can't they?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for that, Anthony. It's been great having you. There's some really useful tips there that I think everyone can get something from. So yes, thank you again.
You're welcome.